Randy, let me start by asking you about your personal experience in writing this book. You were a professor in Texas at Sam Houston State when you wrote this biography of Johnson. Did that shape the writing of the book at all?
I was. And firstly, let me say thank you very much, Aram, for that generous and kind introduction. But yes, I was at Sam Houston at the time, which had spent a number of years there. It was a great time. And I also taught at the University of Houston for a while. So I've spent some time in Texas. And my brother, by the way, still lives in Texas, in Conroe, Texas, and taught Texas history. So though I'm a Pennsylvanian, I do have some connections in Texas still. How did I get started with this book? I had written a dissertation. It was my first book, and it was on Jack Dempsey. And it was a pretty successful book. And I enjoyed doing it. And I'm thoroughly interested in boxing. I've always been interested in boxing. So I thought, I kind of wanted to do something, kind of a history of the heavyweight division, because heavyweight champions are such iconic people. Muhammad Ali, Malcolm, Joe Louis during World War II and the Depression, Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey. And so I was going to look at the heavyweight champions, and I thought I was going to do a chapter on Jack Johnson. And so when I was in Washington, D.C. one time, I decided, well, there's going to be some records of Jack Johnson's life. Since he was accused and convicted of a federal crime, there'll be federal records. But I thought I could get through them in a day or so. So I went to the National Archives, which at this time was still in Washington, D.C. before it moved out into Maryland. And I said, here's what I'm working on. Do you have any records? And they said, yeah, well, we think we do have some records on that. And so I sat there, waited for the records to come up, and suddenly they bring in 3 or 4 trolleys of boxes, maybe 6 boxes to each trolley. I said, you must have this confused. I'm talking about Jack Johnson, the boxer, not Jack Johnson. Is there a singer, Jack Johnson, a blues singer? But the boxer. I said, yeah, this is a boxer. We just declassified this material. And what it was essentially the Bureau of Information. That was the predecessor of the FBI. The Bureau of Investigation's file on Jack Johnson. It was literally, they followed him and filed reports day after day after day, trying to get him convicted of a crime, which they eventually did. And so I realized right then, I was just leafing through this. I just told the National Archives of people, just copy all this material and send it to me. It'll take me forever to get through it. I got through it fairly fast once I got it home to Texas. And that was the beginning of the book.
Well, let's start with the Texas part of the story, right? As we all know, Jack Johnson was born in Galveston, Texas. What do we know about his family? What do we know about his early life? What can you tell us about Black life in Galveston?
Well, Galveston, of course, was the largest city in Texas at that time. And it was, it was a pretty cosmopolitan city because Galveston was an important port, second probably only to New Orleans on the Gulf. And so it was an important port. So a number of African Americans, freed slaves now. Jack Johnson was born in 1878, only 2 years after Reconstruction. So both of his parents were slaves. And his parents, his father particularly, and his mother, both were strong personalities who did great. Though they were born slaves, they took to freedom very easily. The father bought land, nothing spectacular, a little bit. He worked as a janitor. His mother worked as a domestic. They both worked very hard. And so Jack Johnson, was born into this life of an ex-slave, parents, big family, 6 kids, 3 more that died in childbirth. And it was an interesting family, though it's very difficult to capture exactly the tenor of an African-American family at this time, because what do you look at? I look at census reports. I look at land records. I can describe the physical realities of their life, but the emotional realities, not so easy. Except we know that Jack Johnson was very much different than his father. His father was a person who stayed planted in Galveston, worked hard, was not a big striver. He felt comfortable in a smaller life, whereas Jack Johnson always seemed to yearn for more and to have a bigger life and to make a bigger hit in the world.
There's the famous opening chapter of Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man, about the battle royal, right, where a group of black boys are blindfolded and swinging at each other until they knock each other out and pick up coins, right? And we learned from your book that Jack Johnson got his fighting start in these kinds of battle royals, right? Can you tell us about them and what they meant?
Yeah, he certainly fought in battle royals. Battle royals were put on for the entertainment of white spectators and the humiliation of black participants. So you would have, there were an endless variety of battle royals. Sometimes you would have a group, maybe 10, 20 black youths in a ring at the same time, and they would fight each other. And at the end, there'd be one standing, and they'd throw nickels and pennies into the ring, and that person would get it. So it was, dog eat dog fighting. Sometimes, as Ralph Ellison portrays it, the participants were blindfolded. And so they're swinging wildly, getting hit by punches they can't anticipate, pretty brutal. Interestingly enough, as late as Jack Johnson's biggest fight he had in Galveston, they put on an exhibition before the fight where they had two one-legged African-American boys, youths, fighting each other, and again, it was a humiliating, and Ralph Ellison portrays this humiliation, the utter humiliation of participating in this. But again, it was meant as object lessons. It was just a demonstration of who had power and what they could do with their power.
Mm-hmm. And how about boxing itself? It's a sport that has kind of existed at the fringes, so to speak, right? It has been since since the early 19th century. It's been popular in the United States, but also deemed illegal in many places, and always sort of had the sort of working class identity, even though elites were fascinated by it. How about in Texas and in Johnson's life? What was the state of prize fighting there? Was it legal? Can you paint that world for us a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. In 1889, there was the first boxing law passed, and boxing was kind of classified as a pit sport, really. It was put on par with bullfighting, with dog fighting, with bear baiting, with bull baiting, with the other types of pit sports. And it was allowed as long as the person putting it on paid a $500 tax, they permitted boxing. But a few years later, in 1891, I think it was, a new law was passed that prohibited boxing and gave you, $500 to $1,000 fine, and I believe up to a year or so in prison, 60 days to a year or so in prison for participating. The problem was when they passed the new law, they didn't do anything about the old law. They didn't void the old law, so it was in this ambiguous place. But ultimately, what we can say about boxing is people followed it, they were interested in it, they attended boxing matches, and basically they were all illegal. This was pretty much true in virtually every state in the United States. Nevada was a little bit looser, as it is with most things. But boxing just went against the tenor of America at the time. As we're moving into the progressive era, we're trying to clean up the relics of barbarism. We're trying to pass laws to make America a more humane place. But boxing just doesn't fit in with that progressive ideal. I can't imagine Woodrow Wilson in the ring, quite frankly. Although Theodore Roosevelt loved boxing and took boxing lessons and had a private sparring partner and trainer and teacher in the White House with him. So it was part of masculinity. But today boxing is kind of on the rails. I mean, most people I think would be hard pressed to say who is the heavyweight champion. There's probably 4 of them because there's different sanctioning bodies. But there was a time in America, and for the first half of the 20th century, the biggest team title a person could hold in professional sports was a ring from the World Series. The greatest individual title a person could hold was heavyweight champion of the world. They were iconic. John L. Sullivan, Jim Jeffries, as I said, I talked about him before. And finally, the first black heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson.
There's a good relevant question from one of our audience participants, Greg Smith, that asks, did he box barefisted or with gloves? This is around the time when the Marquis of Queensberry rules were coming in.
Gloves. The last barefisted heavyweight championship fight was in, I think it was 1889, between John L. Sullivan and Jake Kilrain. A classic fight. It went 75 rounds, something like that. John L. Sullivan was drinking a concoction of whiskey and tea throughout the early rounds of the bout. About midway, he started throwing up, and somebody said, a wag in the audience said, "Don't worry, he's just getting rid of the tea. He's keeping the alcohol." But that was the last big fight. Vachel Lindsay, the poet, wrote a beautiful poem about it, contrasting Victorian sensibilities with this vibrancy of the heavyweight championship, Jake Kilrain versus John L. Sullivan. But that was the last of the heavyweight championship fights contested with bare knuckles. And then when John L. Sullivan lost a few years later in New Orleans to Jim Corbett, that was with gloves.
Galveston had the massive hurricane in 1900, right? The subject of the great book, Isaac Storm.
Yeah, great. About 6,000 people. Oh, sorry, Aram.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, my question was, how did it have an impact on Johnson's life and his career in any sort of way?
Well, it was an enormous storm in September of 1900. I believe it was September. I forget which, early September maybe. And I think it killed over 6,000 people. And I may be wrong. I haven't followed this stuff, but at one time it was the worst natural disaster in American history, and maybe it still is. Maybe one of the viewers can tell us the answer to that. I don't want to be wrong on it. We know that it wiped out the family's homestead. They kind of disappeared from the records for a while, but they recouped. Jack Johnson at this time, 1900, so he's what? About 22 years old. And he had been making a bit forays out into the wider boxing world. He went to Chicago, a couple other places, but he comes back. He's in Galveston at the time, and we don't know exactly what he did, what happened to his family. Though none of his family died. They reappeared on census records. But he'll spend a couple more years afterwards. And then when he's about 23 or so, he'll leave Galveston for good and follow his profession as a boxer.
Yeah. Rereading Papa Jack this week, I was really struck by the theme of mobility, that he's constantly on the move once he leaves Galveston, right?
He is. And, there's a leitmotif in Johnson's life, and it is mobility. And I think Johnson, to a certain degree, tied mobility to freedom. There's this sense that he was not going to be planted like his father, that he moved around constantly. Jack Johnson constantly talked about driving automobiles and driving fast. And there's this sense of freedom with movement, with the air going past his face. There's one of the great stories. There's a whole bunch of stories, folk tales of Jack Johnson. Most of them probably aren't true, but maybe there's a germ of truth in them. But one of the great folk tales of Jack Johnson's life is he was traveling through some backward, dusty corner of Georgia or Alabama and going through a small town, and he's going way too fast. And a local sheriff stops him and says, "Where are you going, boy, so fast?" And Jack Johnson said, he told him where. And the sheriff said, "Well, you were speeding." And Johnson said, "I suppose so." And the sheriff said, "Well, that's going to cost you $50. And Johnson pulls out a roll of money. Okay. A roll to fit as I've said before, a roll to fit the hand of a heavyweight champion. And he peels off a $100 bill and he gives it to the sheriff. The sheriff says, "I can't change a $100 bill." And Johnson said, "Keep the change. I'm coming back the same way as I went through." And it tells Johnson's fascination with speed, but also kind of one-upping the man.
And that brings us to the theme of race, right? That he was a black boxer in an age when Jim Crow was being instituted throughout the South. What some historians have called the nadir in American race relations, a low point. How did race shape him as a boxer in terms of his style? And did it create limits on his career?
Well, as you can imagine, race was probably the most important factor in his life. I mean, to grow up in the South, I mean, this is a Jim Crow South, as bad as it could get. This is the South that would lynch a black man for any violation perceived or real. So, I mean, thousands of black men were lynched during this period of time. You know, Jack Johnson, you wonder how Jack Johnson became as bold as he was growing up in the Jim Crow South. You know, there was a great story, a guy named Parks, who was kind of the founder of the Chicago Sociological School. And he was at a gathering one time, and Joe Louis was a guest at the gathering, and Parks talked to Joe Louis. And the first question he asked to Joe Louis is, how the hell did you get here? Okay, what made you? How did you become who you are? The same thing you asked with Jack, that I feel with Jack Johnson, is how did Jack Johnson become Jack Johnson? How did he become so bold? You know, did he have a death wish? Was he tempting fate? In Jack Johnson's autobiography, he talks about when he was a young kid, hitchhiking and riding the rails up from Galveston to New York. It's a made-up story. It never happened. But he goes and he meets a guy. He wants to meet his hero, a man by the name of Steve Brody. Steve Brody's probably not a name most people are familiar with, but they would have been in the late 19th, early 20th century. Steve Brody, an Irishman, supposedly jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge, first person to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge and survive. Whether he really jumped off of it, I don't know. Maybe a dummy was thrown off the bridge and he kind of popped up out of the water and they onto a rescue. He parlayed it into a life's work. Okay, a lot of free drinks, and there was a play about it and everything. Jack Johnson, in his autobiography, talks about how obsessed he was and how he wanted to meet Steve Brody and how he did meet Steve Brody. Whether he met him or not, unlikely, but that doesn't matter. The fact is, he admired this bravado. He admired this man who would willingly risk death, and come out alive, you know, tempt fate and able to survive that.
Of living as a black man in the South at the turn of the century were to not draw attention to yourself, right? To use the back door, to say sir, to do all these things that kept you on a lower ground. And Johnson rejects every standard that white society has imposed upon black behavior.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, there was a whole Southern culture of whites dealing with blacks. You know, on a sidewalk, if a white man passed a black man on a sidewalk, the black man would get off the sidewalk and defer. You know, a black man would never even look at a white woman. I mean, that was, you could get lynched for that. It certainly would never look her into the eye. And of course, you know, every inch of the South was segregated. You know, schools segregated, bathrooms, drinking fountains. Everybody's seen the whites and colored signs that were hung throughout the South. But even to the level that school books in the summer from white schools and black schools could not be put in the same closet. They, you know, the fear of the fear of a miscegenation spread even to the closets of school books. So, you know, how does Jack Johnson become who he is? It's pretty clear that he had to move out of the South eventually, or there would have been real problems.
One of the interesting statistics that in your book was about knockout rates, that you know, the white fighters like John L. Sullivan and Jim Jeffries had much higher rates of knocking out boxers than black boxers did, like Peter Jackson and Jack Johnson. Were there different styles associated with white and black boxers?
Yeah, there were. White boxers were kind of straight ahead, swing for the fences, go for the knockout, you know, exhibitions of power. Whereas black boxers tended to be more crafty. They might get a knockout, but it wouldn't be in the early rounds. It would be in the later rounds. And they were also, if they fought a white fighter, they would, even if they won, they would always carry the white fighter. They wouldn't go all out. They, you know, they're just fighting to, not for territory, but just to maneuver.
So take us through Johnson's early career. You know, how did he end up as heavyweight champion?
Interesting story. He starts his career, and you know, there are black heavyweights, there are white heavyweights. he fights. He never does. He won't fight the top white heavyweights because they won't fight him. He'll fight black heavyweights. And there was even a black heavyweight, Negro heavyweight championship that you could hold. And I don't know all the champions, but Sam McVay and Harry Willis and Jack Johnson, they all held this at one time. And oftentimes black fighters would fight each other an inordinate number of times. Like, some of the black fighters fought each other 20 or 30 times in their career. They would fight each other 5 times a year, 6 times, 8 times a year. So Jack Johnson was in this milieu where there were limits. You couldn't fight for the heavyweight championship. Back in 1892, John L. Sullivan issued his famous challenge. He challenged any fighter to fight for the title with a side bet of like $25,000. First come, first serve, except he said, no black fighters are invited. Okay, John L. Sullivan said, I've never fought a black fighter. I never will fight a black fighter. And he drew what was called at the time the color line. No black fighters can fight for the heavyweight championship. Okay, and the people who followed him, Jim Corbett, Robert Fitzsimmons, Jim Jeffries, Burns, Tommy Burns, all drew the same color line. But at some point, Jack Johnson wanted to break this down. He wanted to be heavyweight champion of the world, white or black. And he started to follow Tommy Burns, who was at that time heavyweight champion. Now, boxing had fallen into deep, deep disrepute by this moment in history. It's a high point of the progressive era. Boxing has been chased out of the East. No more fights in New York, no more fights in New Orleans like they had. The only fights that were taking place were fights out in Nevada or some in backwater places in California. And the money wasn't good. So Jim Jeffries retired, who was a great heavyweight champion, and Tommy Burns won the vacated title. And there's no way he can make money. And he goes to England and Ireland. He fights a few fights. Jack Johnson follows him there, but he won't fight him. He goes to Australia. Tommy Burns does. Jack Johnson follows him there. And Tommy Burns says, look, I'll fight you for $30,000. Huge sum of money at that time. Enormous sum of money. And there's a promoter, a guy named Huge Deal McIntosh in California, in Australia. And McIntosh says, okay, I'll come up with the money. So Tommy Burns says, okay, the title's not worth anything anyway. I'll fight Jack Johnson. And I'm a white man, okay? I can beat a black fighter. Well, of course, Jack Johnson destroys him. I mean, it was child's play. And suddenly, 1908, December of 1908, we have a new heavyweight champion, and he's black. And suddenly the shock reverberates through the white race. One of the writers who was a journalist at the fight, Jack London, says, geez, somebody's got to remove the golden smile off of this man's face. Jack Johnson had golden teeth. A couple of teeth that were out where he had replaced with gold teeth. And he said, Jeff, meaning Jeffries, Jeff, it's up to you. You got to redeem the white race. And so now we have the search for the great white hope who can defeat Jack Johnson.
Insert a question from Greg Smith, who said, there's lots of big men who are good with their fists. What were the skills that set Johnson apart? What made him a great boxer?
He was a great tactician. His reflexes were lightning reflexes. He was one of the, if not the greatest defensive fighter that the heavyweight division had ever seen. Nat Fleischer, who was a long-time editor for, 50 years with Ring Magazine, started Ring Magazine, always said that Jack Johnson was the best fighter he had ever seen. And his reflexes were great, and he was just hard to hit. I mean, you would start to throw a punch, and he would literally hit you in the biceps to stop your punch. I mean, he fought with a style where almost a 19th century style, where he laid back and he watched his opponents. It kind of like if you can imagine an artist looking at a painting that they're doing, how maybe they would pull their head back to get a different perspective. So he fought with his head back. He was just really hard to hit, and he would wear people out. He wasn't a first or second round knockout fighter, but he would knock him out in the later rounds. And remember, this is at a time where boxing matches could be scheduled for 45 rounds. It wasn't just, 12 round or 15 round matches. They could be 25, 45 rounds. Sometimes there were fights to the finish till one person knocked the other person out. As a matter of fact, the longest boxing match in history was 110 rounds. That's 3 minute rounds, Queensberry rules, 3 minute rounds and 1 minute rest period in between the rounds. So that's how many? 330 minutes of fighting, and then another 10 minutes or whatever it is of rest. 7 hours? Seven is close to it. That's a long fight. So Jack Johnson was a master of these long ones. Now, when Jack Johnson loses the title, he loses it in the 26th round. That's probably about as long as his fights went.
You mentioned Jack London sort of summoning Jim Jeffries, the former heavyweight champion, to come back and reclaim the title. And so they fight right on July 4th of 1910 in Reno.
July 4th, 1910, yeah. So he wins the title in 1908, comes back to America in 1909, fights a series of great white hopes who really turn out to be great white jokes. One of them is Victor McLaglen. If anybody likes John Ford movies, Victor McLaglen will later become an actor, will win an Oscar for in a John Ford movie called The Informer. And he always plays the gruff kind of sergeant in the Western movies of John Ford. But he was not a really great boxer. He was pretty amateurish. But he fights some other people. He fights Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, if I remember correctly. But eventually, these are light, small potatoes, really. The big hope is Jim Jeffries. And so this fight is set, promoted by Tex Rickard, who became the great promoter of the 1920s of the Dempsey fights. But it's held it's supposed to be in San Francisco, but the governor gets cold feet and chases it out of California. So it's held in Reno, Nevada. I mean, what a great place to hold a fight. You can go and you can gamble, you can get a divorce, you can get drunk, and then you can go to the fight. It's, more than a trifecta. So this is a big fight on America's holiday, July 4th. Fighting it's a racial warfare taking place in small letters. And it's a great fight. Well, it's not a great fight. The people are anxious to see it, but once the fight starts, it's clear that Jack Johnson is Jim Jeffries' master. The great fight Jack Johnson has in here, this match, is he fights in Jim Jeffries' corner is the ex-heavyweight champion Jim Corbett. And Corbett is a verifiable racist. And he's throwing racial slurs at Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson's laughing at him and giving him retorts. So that fight was more competitive than the Jack Johnson-Jim Jeffries fight. And finally, and I think the 15th round, Jack Johnson knocks him out. Now, how important was the fight? Hugely important. The day afterwards, immediately after the news gets out, race riots throughout the nation start to break out. Most cities had riots of some sort. We don't know how many people died. We don't know how many people were injured. But this was, up until Martin Luther King, this was the first individual event that precipitated widespread rioting throughout America. So it showed how important this crown was and this fight was to the United States.
Can you speak to the nature of the rioting? Was it white mobs attacking black neighborhoods, which was a typical pattern of racial violence at that time?
Yeah, by that time, as you know, Aram, far better than I do, when you say rioting, it's white mobs moving into black territories and attacking blacks. It's not going back and forth, not until maybe 1919 where you get kind of the fighting back and forth. But it's mostly mobs going into black territories, or maybe on a streetcar. One African American, was proud of Jack Johnson, said Jack Johnson won, boasting for Jack Johnson. Somebody slit his throat, just killed him for it. I mean, it was a dangerous time to be black in America, but at the same time, it was a great time. Jack Johnson is putting a lie to all this idea of inferiority. Here is at least one realm that Jack Johnson is infinitely superior. And so many black Americans took great pride in Jack Johnson. Now he was troubling to another class, maybe the upper class of Black Americans, and certainly Booker T. Washington didn't like Jack Johnson, and W.E.B. Du Bois didn't like Jack Johnson. But I think the average African American, I think, gloried in Jack Johnson's skills.
Right. Here's a reversal, right, of the power dynamic.
Yeah, exactly.
And manhood, right? How about that theme of manhood, right? The heavyweight champion as the ultimate emblem of manhood, and Black men are denied their full manhood under Jim Crow, right? And so
yeah,
there's a reversal in that.
Yeah, if Jack Johnson can be given a chance to be heavyweight champion
Mhm.
and roll with such supremacy, well, what else could a Black man do? Where, given an opportunity, where else can they excel?
Mhm.
The problem was there was no opportunity given.
Given that challenge to racial mores, we see the fight film getting banned, right? Like they're trying to restrict who sees this movie.
Well, the Jack Johnson fight and Jim Jeffries fight was released,
Mhm.
though it was barred in some towns and some
Mhm.
jurisdiction. But a few years later, Congress will pass a law prohibiting the interstate transportation of fight films. And so you can't take the fight films and show it all over. And that was where a lot of money was made in boxing, was showing these fight films. Yeah, the relationship, and we won't get into it here, but the relationship between the film industry and boxing goes back to Edison. Some of the first things Edison did was take films of boxing matches and sparring matches. And so there's a deep history between fight films and boxing. And I might say that boxing movies are really the best movies, sports movies, I think, in America. I mean, if you think back at not just Rocky, but the setup and Body and Soul, and my favorite, Rocky Balboa.
Mhm.
I had a small walk-on part in by Rocky Balboa.
Is that right?
I told my daughter I'm in two scenes. Like the first scene lasts about this long, second scene about this long. And I told my daughters, who were young at that time, I said, "Could you see I was acting?" They said, "No, why?" I said, "I was pretty good."
Greg Smith had a few questions in the Q&A about how different groups related to Johnson, and you talked a little bit already about how the Black elite sort of tended to frown upon Johnson, right? That he was sort of violating those politics of respectability. What was his relationship with, or did he have any groups of white people, for instance, that were on his side or that befriended him, that saw Johnson from a point of view, or was it purely polarized?
No, I think Johnson had a couple white managers, though. There's a long history of white managers exploiting Black boxers. Nobody really managed Jack Johnson. Okay, he might have had a guy he calls a manager. They would handle some business transaction, but Jack Johnson is pretty much of his own man. He's going to marry 3 white women, so a dangerous proposition at that time in American history. But in terms of actually, a lot of reporters like Jack Johnson, because not only was he fabulous copy, I mean, he was a nice guy. He was a funny guy. I mean, he was an interesting person. He had interests. He spoke different languages, or at least parts of different languages. He played the bass fiddle. He was interested in more than just boxing, and so he was like I said, great copy. But were there huge bodies of white supporters for Jack Johnson? Highly unlikely. I mean, even Joe Louis, until the Max Schmeling fight, most white Americans opposed Joe Louis and hoped that he would get beat, particularly in the South.
But you mentioned the white wives, and we started by talking about the huge paper trail that you found on Johnson and federal surveillance, and that really takes us to 1912 and the passage of the Mann Act, or its application, his being charged under the Mann Act, MANN. Can you tell us about that piece of legislation, why it was applied to Johnson, and what it reveals?
It's coming together of two forces. First of all, this whole campaign, Great White Hope campaign, it continues after 1910. But there are no white fighters, heavyweights in America that can come anywhere close to defeating Jack Johnson. So until Jack Johnson ages significantly, he's going to be heavyweight champion. But there are other Americans that don't like Jack Johnson. They want to get rid of him. How can we get rid of him? Okay, maybe we can get him because he runs afoul of the law. Maybe we can throw him in prison. So they turned to a law called the Mann Act. It was the more fully, it's the White Slavery Act. And the White Slavery Act prohibited the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. It was aimed primarily, white slavery was commercialized prostitution, commercialized vice. Prostitution was huge in America in the progressive era. And there are houses of prostitutions in virtually every town in America. So we're going to curtail prostitution by making it impossible or illegal to transport women primarily from Europe and Eastern Europe. The belief was they were Europeans. Women were coming in through Europe to the United States and becoming prostitutes. Okay. What does this have to do with Jack Johnson? Not really very much. Jack Johnson was married to white women, several white women who had been prostitutes. One of them hadn't been, but several had been. And he frequented houses of prostitution. He was involved with prostitutes. This is common in boxing at this time, okay? Boxers and prostitutes came from kind of the same strata, and they got along. Anyway, so Jack Johnson, one person said, we could try Jack Johnson in violation of the Mann Act, because Jack Johnson was incredibly peripatetic. He was always moving around, and he traveled with prostitutes. He traveled with white women. And the attorney general said, look, that's a total perversion of the act. It wasn't aimed at applying it to, say, a businessman in New York that goes from New York and Hoboken to have an affair with his secretary. That's a perversion of the law. And Jack Johnson was not involved in white trafficking, prostitutes, or anything like that. But somebody else says, well, that's the only option we have. It's either that or watch him continue to beat up on white fighters. So the government attorney general, there's even a kind of a smoking document, a gun that I found. The attorney general says, well, if that's all we got, let's go for it. And so he's tried in 1913 for a violation of the Mann Act. He's found guilty. Yeah, did he travel with a prostitute to from Chicago to Atlantic City? Yeah, to Pittsburgh, sure. And he's sentenced. He's fined maybe $1,000 or so, and sentenced to a year in prison. And after this, then he will flee the country. He'll go up to Montreal and then over to London and Paris. So it accomplished their goal, was to get him out of the country.
He vacated the heavyweight title. He ends up in Europe. And
well, he doesn't vacate the heavyweight title. He remains heavyweight champion. But, most progressives felt, let's get the heavyweight champion out of America anyway. Because he won't lose the heavyweight title until 1915, when he fights Jess Willard, the latest incarnation of the Great White Hopes. And Jess Willard will actually beat an older, heavier, out of shape Jack Johnson, knock him out in 26 rounds. Jack Johnson will later say that it was a fixed fight. And there's one picture of Jack Johnson laying on the canvas in Havana, Cuba, where the fight was held. And he's got his hand over his eyes. He seems to be shielding his eyes from the sun. But it was just an odd picture. As soon as if you see the film, his hand's here for a second, and it goes down, and he's out.
There's a few questions that deal with kind of the in our chat that deal with the legacy of Johnson. A few that circle around Muhammad Ali.
Yes.
Frederick Berner, for instance, asks, how much do you think, or can you verify, that Muhammad Ali thought of Jack Johnson as a role model? And the person asking this question, Mr. Berner, says he took one of your sport history classes when you were at Sam Houston State in the mid-1980s.
Oh, outstanding.
Said it was a great experience. So talk about a full circle moment.
I feel good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I'm not sure he'd recognize me. I was young then. My hair was not gray. And quite frankly, I had significantly more hair. But anyway, that's the outrageous fortunes of youth.
Mhm.
Anyway, the question, what was the question again, Aram? I got carried away.
So what did Ali sort of emulate
Ali,
Jack
yes.
Johnson
Ali,
and including in his off the, both in the ring and outside of the ring?
yes, definitely. Ali was interested in Jack Johnson and saw himself as Jack Johnson. As a matter of fact, there was a play in New York that became a film called The Great White Hope that was about Jack Johnson. And it's an angry, I just watched it within the last few months, and it's a very angry film, but it portrays Jack Johnson in a very Muhammad Ali way. As a, Jack Johnson was not Muhammad Ali. He was not a Black Moses. He was not overtly political. Okay, he let his lifestyle speak for itself. He was not the political creature that Ali was. But Ali, before the one of the biggest defenses, it might have been the Frazier fight, watched films of Jack Johnson fighting, and he even said that the anchor punch that he knocked Liston out in the second fight up in Maine, in Lewiston, Maine. The anchor punch that nobody saw that he knocked out Sonny Liston came from Jack Johnson. But the story was, and the truth was, he was watching films of Jack Johnson. And when they got into the ring, Bundy, who was his alter ego, Bundy said to Jack Johnson, said to Muhammad Ali, "Ghost in the house, ghost in the house," meaning Jack Johnson was in the house, ghost in the house. And so Ali identified with Jack Johnson, not Joe Louis, but Jack Johnson. It's a great question.
Yeah, we had another question from Greg Smith that asked about the Great White Hope specifically, asking if it was faithful to Johnson's life. And I would say, you know this much better than I do, but I remember when I watched that movie that it seemed much more like a movie about Muhammad Ali placed in the past than it did a movie about Jack Johnson.
I think so. I think it's a movie about Ali when he had been stripped of his title, when there was a real anger, around the time of the death of Malcolm X and the assassination of Malcolm X, where Ali was in a bad mood. Yeah, I think there's a political edge to it. And that's James Earl Jones playing it, movie. But originally the play was Yapikito, who was a much bigger than Jones and a far more physical actor. And really the anger, Jim Jones, the Jones film really puts it, kind of ratchets down the anger, and it's still pretty explosive.
Before I ask the next question, I just want to again encourage more questions into the Q&A. We have time for more questions. And let me ask another one. You had a question from Marlon Nation that asked about the documentary film Unforgivable Blackness. Is it a good representation of his life? Now, you were in it, so maybe you have some thoughts on that.
I am a great fan of Ken Burns. I think Ken Burns does great stuff, and he put together. I remember I got a call from Ken Burns, from his team, not Ken initially, about somebody had read the book that I had done, and they said they wanted to do a documentary on it. Would I be part of it? As a on screen, but also kind of reading the script. And I said, sure. And then I didn't hear from anybody for, I think it must have been 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years. And I thought, well, it's like when I signed options for movies. They never come about. So I figured this isn't going to come about. Then all of a sudden I heard from them. And like in the next 6 months, they did everything. I mean, it's an incredible team. But I think it's great. I love the title Unforgivable Blackness, which comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, where he talks about Jack Johnson and why was he hated so much. And he says, if a white fighter went out with a prostitute, is everybody going to get up in arms about it? If a white fighter doesn't live the most moral lifestyle, is anybody going to get onto it? Why the anger towards Jack Johnson? And it all comes down to, W.E.B. Du Bois said, it all comes down to this unforgivable blackness. And it's, it's such a powerful line. And, there were three major Black leaders or examples in late 19th, early 20th century. One was W.E.B. Du Bois. The other was Booker T. Washington. The other, I think, was Jack Johnson. Booker T. Washington said, look, don't worry about gaining things socially. Don't just work hard, look for economic advancements. Don't worry about politics. It will come, kind of this accommodationist approach. Booker T, excuse me, that was Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois said, we want everything. We want political advancement. We want social advancement. All. Jack Johnson said, look at me, I'm living as a free man, and his was, it's not what he said, it's how he lived. If I said W.E.B. Du Bois and mixed him up with Booker T. Washington, I'm sorry.
No, I think you had it right. It's an interesting lens, the way that each of the two men sees Johnson. Both of them in different ways are fret about Johnson, right, and what he means. But for Washington, it's, oh no, this is a disaster. He's going to sort of ruin our good name. And Du Bois really casts it more in terms of, these are the reasons why he is why he's condemned, because of this unforgivable blackness. Like, I don't necessarily support him, but we're also applying a racial double standard. So there's a lot of nuance that, like, students often will focus on. This is an interesting way in my sports history class to think about black politics at this time through their opinions about a sporting figure.
Aram, who do your students not identify the most with, but admire the most? Al Lee, Lewis, or Jack Johnson?
A lot of students only know Ali coming into class. They might not know anything about Joe Louis or Jack Johnson prior to the class, but they know, of course, Muhammad Ali because he's so iconic and more recent. I don't think generally I find that my students don't know much at all, or and never even heard of Jack Johnson. They've heard the name Joe Louis, but maybe not even heard the name of Jack Johnson.
That's interesting. To me, and a question I've been asked a number of times at different venues is, what was the greatest fight in history? And I always say, well, to me, significance, I always look for a political significance. There's three fights. There's Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries in 1910. There's Joe Louis, Max Schmeling in 1938. And there's Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier in 1971, I think. And I say, those are the three most important. Which do you think is the most important of those three? Or is there somebody I'm missing?
In terms of political significance, the first two are more politically significant than the third one. In terms of spectacle, in terms of hype, the Ali Frazier fight has to take the cake, I would imagine, for that.
Ali Frazier, yeah. But that's a pretty Ali Frazier, though. People identified, most white.
That's true.
You ask a person, I know, well, it's from my era and I grew up in it. But if you asked a person, who are you in favor of, Muhammad Ali or Jack or Frazier, Joe Frazier? The answer told me just about everything I needed to know about the person's politics, whether they're black or white. It kind of, the two of them are really American affairs. The other one is more international. Although the Burns-Johnson fight, racism was running rampant in South Africa, in Australia, and New Zealand, and so it was a significant fight down under too. The racism was not just in America. I mean, racism was pretty much of a international phenomenon.
What makes boxing so fun to write about for the historian is that it really dramatizes conflict, right? But you've talked to me in the past about sort of how you like the pace of writing about boxing. Could you speak to that for our audience? Why it's sort of appealing to you as a narrative historian?
Well, because to begin with, boxing is narrative. Okay. Most people don't care about a boxing match. Okay. And many boxing matches, quite frankly, are kind of boring. If you see two really good defensive fighters, you have to really like boxing to appreciate the fight. But boxing starts with signing a fight, okay, and it might even start before, where there's a kind of a drama trying to get the two fighters to sign a fight. But once they sign a fight, you have a reporter that has to cover this fight, at least in the old days, and they would go to the training camps. And they would go to live with the fighters and talk with the fighters constantly. And then they go to the fight and then post-fight. And they have to develop narratives to keep people interested. I mean, you have a weigh-in. Weigh-ins aren't that exciting. So, but now you see weigh-ins and the fighters look like they're going to fight in during the weigh-in. They're not, believe me, but it's all show. But you have these narratives that are developed. And particularly around great fighters, you have these international narratives, whether it's Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather. We all know these people through their narratives. And so I find that really interesting to talk about and to follow.
Mm-hmm.
You're writing about sports writers. Aram's writing a book about sports writing today. I don't think I'm giving anything away. It's going to be a great book.
It's not a secret.
which sports do you like reading the most?
Well, what's most interesting to see is the quality of the writer goes with different sports over time. Boxing and baseball get the best writers in the 50s and 60s. So, in your daily columns, the Red Smiths and the Jimmy Cannons, right, the great columnists, they'll write about boxing or baseball if given the opportunity, much more so than any other sport. The great magazine writer A.J. Liebling at the New Yorker, right, the only sport that he writes about is boxing, and he treats it as sort of a spectacle, an experience, and he puts it in really personal terms. He was almost like a forerunner to the new journalism. When Norman Mailer writes his first piece about sports, is his famous piece in Esquire in 1962 about the fight between Floyd Patterson and Sonny Liston, when Liston knocks out Patterson for the championship, and it's this massive 20,000 word piece that sort of paints the whole world around this bout. And boxing continues to get this sort of poetic frame from writers. If you think about like Mark Cram, who wrote for Sports Illustrated in the early 70s, George Plimpton, and putting himself in the boxing ring, but then writing about Ali. The boxing tends to inspire the most creativity among the writers for the reasons I think that you mentioned, right? There's time, there's a buildup, there's a ritual, and then there's the drama of the actual clash, and so there's a massive symbolism that goes with that.
And Joyce Carol Oates.
Joyce Carol Oates writes beautiful book about
adding
that.
a kind of a female perspective to boxing. I can't think of a Joyce Carol Oates in basketball or in baseball. There probably is, but I just can't think of it.
And basketball is a sweaty nothing sport in the late 50s, but by the early 70s, there's a young generation that grew up with basketball. That's urban, that tends to be Jewish, that tends to be sort of more socially conscious, that are more accepting of Black athletes, and there's some great writing about basketball.
Any good Texas writers that write about boxing?
Well, our last event for Humanities Texas and Sports in the Lone Star State was about the so-called literary outlaws, and that included Dan Jenkins, who mostly wrote about. He was the great writer for Sports Illustrated in the 60s and 70s, who mostly wrote about college football and golf, which were his two, sort of Texas obsessions. Bud Shrake wrote about everything, including pro football and college football. He's another one of these literary outlaws. Peter Gent wrote mostly about football, which was his experience. He'd been a
North Dallas
for the Dallas Cowboys. They wrote the famous novel North Dallas 40. So Texas writers are mostly associated with football more than anything else.
You talk to somebody who's listening. I hope they're still listening, from Sam Houston when I was there, and Sam Houston used to have a boxing card that they would put on. It would be like students, some pretty tough students, and then they would fight pretty good amateurs that would come from Cut and Shoot, Texas. And have you ever heard of Cut and Shoot, Texas? Oh, it's a great place. A guy who fought for the heavyweight champion, Roy Harris, fought Floyd Patterson for the heavyweight champion, came from Cut and Shoot. And I just love the name Cut and Shoot. It's one of the great town names there is. But they used to fight at Sam Houston. And actually, in one of the fights cards, my brother, Craig, who still lives in Texas, fought. And I was in his corner. I had to stop the fight. If Craig's listening, he's probably in bed. I mean, he wasn't hurt, but he was knocked down a few times and he was cut a little bit. So I felt bad. It gave me a sense of what it must be like to be a manager or a trainer for one of these guys. It's it's pretty violent. But anyway, maybe the Sam Houston connection remembers those cards. They're always fun.
Have you ever boxed yourself?
Only on a playful way. I wasn't quite as bad as George Plimpton. George Plimpton talked about when he boxed, he had a a reaction when he got punched in the nose. His nose started to bleed, and tears welled up.
Tears up, yeah.
It wasn't quite that bad of a reaction, but it was close.
Your former student, Frederick, asked about those bouts. Were those at the Jolly Fox?
They were in a bar. I forget the name of the bar. Yes.
And we have a question from Christopher Davis. He says, while boxing has declined in popularity in recent years, other combat sports like MMA and UFC have gained popularity. What do you make of this change? As a historian, how do you frame it?
I think that's really interesting because, you can think of, okay, we live in a different time. Boxing is a barbarous sport. A person could say it should be outlawed, but really the MMA, I don't know if it's as violent as boxing. It's bloodier than boxing, but in the MMA, they're really quick to stop a fight. If somebody gets hit hard and they go down and they look incapacitated, the fight's over. They will stop it immediately. Whereas a boxing match, a guy can get knocked down and can be really hurt. But if he gets up and can hold his hands in front of him, they're going to let the fight go on. The problem I have with the MMA, and I don't have a problem with it, is that I haven't gotten the narratives of the people. I mean, I don't know who is the Manny Pacquiao. I don't know who is the Floyd Mayweather. I don't know who the Muhammad Ali. I don't know them as individuals. And so many of them, and it's one of the problems with boxing is that it's so internationalized. It used to be all heavyweight champions were Americans, virtually all of them. Since Mike Tyson, they've virtually all been, from the Ukraine, from Russia, from some other part of the country. And, oftentimes language skills create problems with becoming really getting close to the fighters. So I don't know. I think they have to develop better public relations or better narratives, better stories that you can follow.
I wonder part of that too.
How many people from MMA, from those different types of fightings can you name, Aram?
0.
Yeah, okay.
But then again, like I think in general, our sports fandom has become more, we've been driven into whatever sport we're already interested in. We can learn a lot about that sport. But because, and maybe this is showing my age, but because we don't open the sports page anymore, like I never read the article about hockey. I never read the article about tennis, sports that I've just sort of knew a little bit about before. I couldn't name 5 hockey players or three tennis players anymore. And those are sports I used to know something, the basics about. So I think part of it is just the way that we consume sports in terms of reading and learning about it has changed a lot.
Yeah, and we don't have a sports
something like MMA. We don't have any experience through which, if you haven't started following MMA, you're not going to start developing those understanding of those personalities and characters. Maybe.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Oh, your brother Craig says that you did box in the basement.
And I would box Craig, and the great thing about boxing my brother is you could hit him as hard as you wanted to hit him, and it just made no dent in him. Now he was a guy. He was a pretty big guy. Played football at Kentucky, and I pounded him when he was 2 years older than me. And I pounded him. And I'll give this to him. When he suddenly he emerges, he's 6'4" and he's 220 pounds or what have you. He never took it out on me. He never exacted revenge. That's true brotherly love.
I have the exact same experience. My younger brother is about 6'3" and who knows how many more pounds than me. And he never destroyed me the way he could have had he chosen to.
We chose our brothers carefully.
Yeah. And as a follow-up on the discussion about the Jolly Fox, Craig says that it was not at the Jolly Fox. It was out of town at what he thinks was a skating facility. So
I remember it as being in town, right on the. I think he's wrong on that, but he may have suffered some brain damage in that fight.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, Randy, thank you so much for this conversation. Well, we learned a lot about Jack Johnson and his meaning in American culture, and particularly his Texas roots. And thank you to the audience for these outstanding questions and for your attention. I hope that you are as entertained by Randy and educated by him as I was and as I continue to be over all these years. So thank you very much, Randy, and thank you to everyone for joining us.